The air in the livestock pavilion at the August County Fair was thick with the ghosts of better years. It smelled of disinfectant, desperation, and the cloying sweetness of prize ribbon molasses feeds offered to animals that were no longer there. Silas Blackwood stood beside the only boar in the champion's pen, a magnificent, cream-colored giant named Sterling VII. But a fine tremor ran through the animal's flank, and its breathing was just a little too shallow, a little too fast. Blackwood's hand, resting on the pen's rail, was white at the knuckles. His smile was a blade of ice. His gaze was fixed across the dusty aisle, where Elara Vaughan stood beside a creature that was Sterling's opposite in every way. Her boar was a dark, bristled thing of indeterminate breeding, more rock than pig, with a low-slung body and a head like a battering ram. He stood with an unnerving stillness, his small, intelligent eyes taking in the scene.
Alara's hand rested on his broad, coarse-haired back, and she was just as still, a calm, a deep well in the tense, overheated air. 3 years. 3 years since every man, woman, and child in Stony Creek Hollow had looked at Elara Vaughan and seen a fool, a woman driven to madness by grief. They said she was trying to bottle-feed a curse. It was easier, after all, to believe a thing was cursed than to admit you were the one who had been blind. By the way, wherever in the world you're watching from right now, let me know in the comments. I love seeing how far these stories reach. Okay, where were we? The beginning of it, the real beginning, had been a day of iron-grey sky and bitter wind in the last week of March. A day that promised spring, but still held the deep, aching cold of winter in its bones. News had travelled fast through the hollow, the way bad news always does. Silas Blackwood's prize-winning sow, the famous Queen Anne's lace, had finally been found.
She'd broken out of her pristine, climate-controlled barn weeks before, a wild instinct pulling her from comfort towards some ancestral memory. They found her in a laurel thicket on the far side of the ridge, dead. She had farrowed in a shallow scrape of leaves and dirt, and in her final, fevered delirium had crushed the life from her own issue. A whole litter of priceless genetics, gone. A knot of farmers stood around the scene, their hats in their hands, their voices low and respectful of the financial tragedy. Blackwood was there, his face a mask of controlled fury. He poked at the frozen, perfectly formed bodies of the dead piglets with the toe of his expensive boot. A waste. A complete and utter waste. Then a sound. A faint, wretched squeak from beneath the sow's still shoulder. One of Blackwood's hired hands reached down and pulled out a single, shuddering survivor.
It was the runt, impossibly small, its back leg bent at a bad angle, and a deep purple bruise blooming across its ribs where the sow's weight had nearly finished it. It was, by any practical measure, already dead. Not worth the effort to drown it, Blackwood pronounced, his voice final. He turned to walk away, the matter concluded. The men murmured in agreement. In the arithmetic of farming, you do not throw good money after bad. You do not waste warm milk and precious time on a foregone conclusion. I'll take him. The voice was quiet, but it cut through the wind. Every head turned. It was Elara Vaughan standing at the edge of the clearing. She had been a widow for 2 years, ever since her husband David's logging chain had snapped. The community had held its breath, waiting for her to sell the small, rocky farm and move back to town, back to civilization. But she hadn't. She had stayed, one woman alone, a puzzle they couldn't solve, an object of their collective, suffocating pity. I'll give you $1 for him, she said, her eyes on the trembling piglet, not on Blackwood. A ripple of disbelief, then amusement, went through the men. $1? For that? Silas Blackwood stopped and turned, a slow, condescending smile spreading across his face. He saw the pity in her, the soft heart of a grieving woman who didn't understand the hard math of the world. He decided to make a lesson of it. $1, he boomed for the benefit of the assembled audience. Sold to the widow Vaughan for $1. Let it be known that Blackwood Farms is a charitable enterprise. He gestured for the hired hand to give her the piglet. The man handed it over with a shrug, as if passing her a bundle of rags. The piglet was cold, its tiny body vibrating with a frantic, failing energy. Ilara held it against the worn wool of her coat, tucking it into the warmth of her body, and met Blackwood's mocking gaze without a word. She turned and walked back the way she came, the sound of the men's low, pitying laughter following her down the trail. Silence, she had learned, was a reply they didn't know how to answer. Being right was its own kind of reply, too. But that would have to wait. The farm was as the men pictured it, small, stubborn, clinging to the side of the hill. The fences were mended and mended again. The barn was old but sound. The house was clean but quiet. Too quiet. After David's death, the silence had been a physical presence, a weight in every room. The first few months, the women of the hollow had brought casseroles and condolences, their eyes full of a pity that felt like judgment. They spoke of God's will, of moving on, which always meant moving away. They saw a woman unmoored, a project to be managed.
Ilara had accepted their food with quiet thanks and endured their advice with a stillness they mistook for weakness. But she wasn't weak. David had loved this land, its impossible rocks and stubborn trees. He'd seen a future in it. Leaving it would have been a second death. So she stayed. One person, alone. The phrase, in the mouths of her neighbours, was a sentence, a life term of solitary confinement. But in the quiet of her own mind, Ilara was slowly turning it into something else. A beginning. She worked. She learned the rhythms of solitude, the language of the land when there were no human voices to drown it out. She learned to read the sky for rain, the trees for the coming of winter, the ground for what it would and would not give. She was not a fool, and she was not mad. She was a woman who had lost everything and had decided to build a new life from the stones of the old one. The community saw a widow clinging to a ghost. What they failed to see was a woman forging herself into something new, something as tough and resilient as the stony ground beneath her feet. Her stubbornness, they called it, a quality that grew best in poor conditions. She carried the piglet into her kitchen, the warmth of the wood stove a welcome shock after the cold outside. It was worse than she'd thought. One of its back legs was clearly broken, and its breathing was shallow, punctuated by tiny, hitching gasps. It refused the rag soaked in warm goat's milk she offered. Its eyes were squeezed shut, its body a knot of cold and pain. It was dying. She knew the arithmetic, the cost of the goat's milk, the time spent, the inevitable heartbreak. It all added up to a net loss. This was the logic of Silas Blackwood, the logic of the world, but Ilara was running a different set of books now, the arithmetic of hope. The cost of $1 plus a few weeks of milk measured against the vast, echoing emptiness of the house. The piglet was a flicker of life in a place that had felt too much like a tomb. In that equation, the risk was worth it. That evening, as dusk settled like blue dust in the hollow, she had a visitor. Old man Hemlock, her nearest neighbour, stood on her porch, a gnarled man with eyes as clear and ancient as creek water. He was from what the locals called the old country, a place of mountains and hardship that had etched itself onto his face. He nodded a greeting, his English clipped and sparse. He'd seen the whole exchange with Blackwood from his own property line. "They laugh," he said. It wasn't a question. "Yes," Ilara said. He peered at the small box by the stove where the piglet lay wrapped in flannel, still refusing to nurse. He didn't offer pity or advice. He simply looked, his gaze taking in the scene with a farmer's quiet assessment.
He watched Ilara try again with the milk, her movements patient and gentle. After a long silence, he grunted.
He pointed a crooked finger at the rocky soil of her yard, visible through the kitchen window.
Hard ground, he said. Then he looked at her, his eyes holding hers. The best roots grow in the hardest ground. He nodded once, as if the matter was settled, and then he turned and shuffled off into the twilight, leaving the words hanging in the quiet kitchen. The best roots grow in the hardest ground. Ilara looked from the stubborn earth of her farm to the broken creature in the box. It wasn't just a saying. It was a map. A few days later, the boy appeared. Finn was the middle child of 7 from the O'Malley farm down the road, a place overflowing with noise and children and the general air of loving neglect. Finn was a quiet, watchful boy, easily lost in the shuffle. He showed up at Ilara's fence line, his eyes wide, and just stood there. He didn't say anything. He just watched.
Ilara was mending a fence post, and she went on with her work, sensing that any direct approach would spook him.
After a while, he pointed a thin finger toward the house. "You got him," he whispered. Ilara nodded. "He's inside." The next day, Finn was back, this time with a pocketful of acorns he'd collected. "For him," he said, holding them out. Ilara invited him in. The piglet was still a fragile thing, but it had finally, miraculously, started to take milk from a bottle. Its broken leg had been splinted with 2 small sticks and strips of cloth. It was a pathetic sight, but it was alive. Finn knelt by the box, his gaze full of an unwavering, uncritical adoration. He stayed for an hour in perfect silence, just watching the piglet breathe. He came back every day after that. He was the one who named him.
Ilara had been calling him the runt, or the little one.
One afternoon, as the piglet, now strong enough to wobble around the kitchen on its splinted leg, managed to tip over a small bucket of scraps, Finn laughed. "He's strong," he said. "He's a stout fellow." And the name stuck. Stout. It was a name spoken with the pure faith of a child, a prophecy more than a description. Finn's presence was a quiet comfort, his belief in the piglet's survival a counterweight to the world's doubt. He became Ilara's silent partner in the venture, a co-conspirator in hope. The work was slow and methodical, a litany of unglamorous tasks. It began with the bottle. 4 times a day, Ilara would heat the goat's milk, test it on her wrist, and patiently hold the bottle for the greedy, sucking mouth. The cost of the milk was a constant nagging figure in her internal ledger, the arithmetic of survival. Every drop he drank was a small victory against the cold logic that said he should be dead.
The splint on his leg had to be changed and checked, the skin kept clean. There was the smell of sour milk and manure, a constant earthy perfume in the corner of her kitchen. As Stout grew, the labour evolved. Winter finally broke, giving way to the thick, grasping mud of a Stony Creek spring. Ilara moved him to a small, clean pen in the barn, reinforcing the boards to hold him. She started him on a mash of ground corn and milk, then slowly introduced cooked vegetables and scraps from her own table. Finn would arrive each day with treasures: wild onions, grubs dug from a rotten log, a pocketful of clover. They were offerings laid at the altar of a growing god. Summer came, hot and heavy, and Stout's growth became undeniable. He was not a pretty pig. The pristine pink and cream of Blackwood's stock was nowhere to be found. Stout's hair was a coarse, dark bristle, almost black, and his skin had a healthy, muddy glow. His body was long and deep, his shoulders broadening into a shield of muscle. The broken leg had healed with a slight thickness, giving him a rolling, purposeful gait. He was not fat, he was powerful. Ilara expanded his world. She fenced off a 2-acre section of woodlot at the back of her property, a piece of land most farmers would consider useless, full of rocks and scrub oak and hickory trees. For Stout,
It was paradise. He spent his days rooting, his powerful snout turning over dirt and stones with an audible crunch. He unearthed tubers and grubs, feasted on fallen acorns and hickory nuts, and wallowed in a muddy patch where a small spring surfaced. He was part domestic pig, part wild boar, a perfect fusion of genetics and environment. He was becoming what the land had made him. Through that summer and into the crisping air of fall, Ilara worked. She harvested her garden, canning and preserving, the rhythmic pop of sealing lids a counterpoint to the quiet of the house. She chopped wood, stacking it high against the barn, her body growing lean and strong with the labour. And she watched her boar. She saw the intelligence in his eyes, the way he watched her, the way he tested the fences, not with brute force, but with a patient, probing curiosity. He was different. The wildness he'd inherited from his mother's desperate flight, combined with the hardiness he'd learned from his own fight for survival, had created something new. He was the living embodiment of Old Man Hemlock's words. His roots were in the hardest ground imaginable, and they were growing deep and strong. She kept him hidden. When other farmers drove past on the main road, they saw only Ilara Vaughan's tidy, lonely farm. The woodlot at the back was out of sight, and she intended to keep it that way. Success, she knew, was a thing best kept like a coal banked under ash. Let the world think the fire was out. She would know when it was time to let it breathe. It was easier for them to believe the piglet had died, easier to continue pitying her than for them to confront the possibility that they and their confident pronouncements had been wrong. Silas Blackwood made a point of stopping by twice a year, usually in the spring and fall, on his rounds through the county. He considered it his duty as the head of the Breeders' Cooperative, a benevolent lord surveying his fiefdom. His visits to Ilara's farm were a special kind of performance. He would pull up in his clean new truck, a stark contrast to her aging farm-all. He'd lean against the fence, his arms crossed, and survey her small, neat vegetable patch, her mended fences, a quiet house. "Still at it, Ilara," he'd say, his tone a mixture of wonder and condescension. "I do admire your grit." The words were meant to sound like a compliment, but they landed like a judgment. Grit was what you had when you didn't have sense. His first visit after she'd taken the piglet was in the late fall. He was brimming with self-satisfaction, his herds healthy, his profits high. "A shame about that little runt," he said, not even bothering to frame it as a question. "But it was for the best. A mercy, really. Saved you a lot of trouble." Ilara was turning soil in her garden bed, preparing it for winter. She didn't stop, she just pushed the fork into the dark earth and leveraged another clump of soil over. The silence stretched. Blackwood shifted his weight, unused to being met with a lack of response. "Well," he said, clearing his throat, "just wanted to check in. Remember, my offer still stands. When this gets to be too much for you, I'll give you a fair price for the land. More than fair." He was offering charity disguised as a deal, a way to control her narrative, to be the hero who saved the poor widow from her own foolish pride. "I'm not selling, Silas," she said, her voice even, her back still to him. He left in a cloud of dust and self-importance, convinced of her folly. He came again the following spring. By now, Stout was a significant presence, a young boar of nearly 300 pounds, hidden away in his woodlot. Blackwood was full of talk about his new breeding lines, pigs genetically engineered for leanness and rapid growth, the very pinnacle of modern agriculture. "Perfection, Ilara," he'd said, leaning on the gate. "We've bred all the wildness out of them, all the inefficiency, pure, predictable profit." He gestured around her farm. "This is the old way. It's noble, I suppose, but it's a dead end." He asked no more about the piglet. It was a forgotten joke. Her continued silence and simple one-sentence replies only confirmed his opinion of her. She was a strange, sad woman, lost in the past. He could not imagine she was building a future he couldn't even conceive of. Each time he left, Ilara would watch his truck disappear down the road, and she would feel a quiet, steady resolve. His world was built on price, hers was built on worth.
And she was beginning to understand that the two were not the same thing at all.
The price of stout was $1. His worth was something she was still discovering, a value banked deep in his hardy bones and wild blood. The reckoning began not with a bang, but with a cough, a dry, hacking sound that echoed across the hollow in the late summer of Stout's second year. It started at the Miller farm, then the Thompson place. It was the glass lung, they called it, a new, vicious strain of respiratory plague that seemed to target the pigs. At first, people dismissed it as a seasonal ailment, but it didn't pass. The coughing worsened, turning into a desperate, rasping fight for air. The pigs would stand, heads down, sides heaving, until their lungs, brittle as spun glass, would simply give out. Vets were called, medicines were administered, but nothing worked. It spread like a rumor, then like a fire.
It travelled on the wind, on the tires of feed trucks, on the boots of farmers visiting one another to compare notes and share their growing dread. The plague had a terrible, specific cruelty. It seemed to have a preference. The heritage breeds, the old-fashioned fatty pigs kept by a few old-timers, seemed to get a milder version, or sometimes escape it altogether. But the modern, streamlined, profitable pigs, the very animals that Silas Blackwood's cooperative had spent a decade perfecting and selling throughout the county, were decimated. Their finely tuned bodies, bred for rapid, lean growth in sterile environments, had no defense. Their immune systems were as fragile as their lungs. Perfection, it turned out, was brittle. Blackwood's empire of predictable profit began to crumble. His own vast, immaculate barns became echo chambers of death. The price of pork plummeted as farmers tried to sell off their herds before they sickened, flooding the market. Then the quarantines came. Fences were posted with stark warnings. The air of the hollow, once filled with the smell of hay and livestock, now carried the acrid chemical scent of lime and disinfectant, and the deeper, darker smell of burning pyres. The sound of the hollow became the sound of coughing, of shovels on dirt, of a profound and terrible silence where the grunting and squealing of a healthy herd used to be. It was a slow, agonizing unraveling of the entire region's economy, a brutal lesson in the difference between a portfolio and a pig. Ilara's farm, tucked away on its rocky hillside, became an island. The wind that blew over her land seemed to carry no sickness. A small flock of chickens scratched in the dirt, goats chewed their cud, and in the woodlot at the back of the property, a single, massive boar rooted for acorns, his breath coming in deep, untroubled gusts. The change in the hollow's perception of Ilara Vaughan was not sudden. It was a slow curdling of pity into suspicion. At first, it was just luck. She was isolated. She didn't deal with the co-op. But as weeks turned into months and the devastation became total, luck began to seem an insufficient explanation. Whispers started in the general store over party-line telephones. How was it her place was untouched? Had she made a deal with something? The same people who had laughed at her for taking the runt now looked at her with a new, fearful curiosity. It is always easier to believe a thing is unnatural than to admit that your own judgment was profoundly, embarrassingly wrong. The first person to see Stout for what he was not a person at all, but a desperate fox. Driven by hunger from the woods, it had been preying on chickens throughout the valley. It slipped through Ilara's fence one night, silent as a shadow. It was met not by a dog, but by a low, rumbling growl from the darkness of the woodlot. The next morning, Ilara found the fox's body near the fence line, its neck broken by a single powerful toss of a tusked head. The word spread. The mockery that had surrounded Ilara curdled completely, first into a grudging respect, and then into a desperate, dawning hope. Farmers, their own pens empty and silent, would drive slowly past her property, trying to catch a glimpse of the boar they now called Vaughan's ghost. They saw him sometimes, a dark shape moving through the trees, a picture of rugged, impossible health. He was no longer a joke. He was a miracle, or a monster. They weren't sure which. But they knew, with a certainty that settled deep in their bones, that he was the only thing like him left. Silas Blackwood was a man watching his life's work burn to the ground, his fortune, his reputation, his entire philosophy of breeding. It was all turning to ash. The glass lung had destroyed nearly his entire stock. His perfect genetics had been proven to be a fatal liability. He was facing ruin. But Silas was a survivor. He began to hear the whispers from Stony Creek Hollow, the same whispers his customers were hearing. Talk of a boar, a freak of nature, immune to the plague. A boar sired by his own escaped sow, a detail he found both galling and potentially useful. He sent one of his remaining hired hands, a man named Jeb, to investigate. "Be discreet," he'd ordered. "I want to know what she has. Everything." Jeb came back a day later, his eyes wide. "It's true, Mr. Blackwood," he said, his voice hushed. "It's the biggest, meanest-looking boar I ever saw. But healthy. Lord, is he healthy. Saw him rooting around, happy as a clam. And that's not all." Jeb hesitated. "She's got a few gilts back there too, young ones. From him, I reckon. 3 of them, healthy as their sire." 3 gilts. The number registered in Blackwood's mind, a key piece of data in a new and desperate calculation. The boar was a genetic goldmine, a repository of the very resilience his own line so disastrously lacked. He had to have him. Or, more precisely, he had to control his bloodline. He couldn't afford to buy him outright, not at the price a desperate market would now command. He would have to use a different kind of leverage. He would use charity. He would use the weight of the community. He drove his clean truck up the winding dirt road to Ilara's farm, his face arranged in an expression of solemn gravity. He found her splitting wood by the barn, the rhythmic thud of the axe a steady heartbeat. He didn't bother with pleasantries. "Ilara," he began, his voice imbued with a false warmth that set her teeth on edge, "the county is in crisis. Our way of life is on the verge of collapse. I've lost almost everything. The Millers, the Thompsons, everyone is wiped out." He paused, letting the weight of the tragedy settle. "But you, by some miracle, have been spared." He looked toward the back of the property. "I've heard the stories about your boar. They say he's immune." Ilara rested her axe on the chopping block. She said nothing. Her silence was a wall. Blackwood pressed on, misreading her stillness as uncertainty. "I'm here to make you an offer, a proposal to save this community. I want to buy your boar. I'll use him to rebuild the herds, my herd, the county's herds. I'll make you a full partner in the new cooperative." He saw a flicker in her eyes and mistook it for interest. "But I know you're not a wealthy woman. You can't afford to just give him away. So I am prepared to be generous. $200, cash." He said the number as if it were a fortune. $200 for the animal that held the future of the entire region in its DNA. Ilara's gaze was level. "He's not for sale." Blackwood's mask of benevolence slipped for a fraction of a second. Annoyance flashed in his eyes. He quickly composed himself. "Now, Ilara, let's be practical. What can one woman do with a boar like that? This is bigger than you. It's about all of us."
He softened his voice again, leaning in as if sharing a secret. Look, I'll be honest. I'm stretched thin, but I want to do right by you. I'll tell you what. He made a show of magnanimous rethinking. 200 for the boar. And to show my good faith, I'll even take those 3 little gilts off your hands. $50 apiece. That's $350, Ilara, more than enough to see you through the winter. And there it was, the slip, the single fatal piece of information he should not have possessed. 3 gilts. No one knew about the 3 gilts she had carefully selected and kept hidden with Stout. No one could have seen them from the road. No one, except a man who had been spying on her property. The arithmetic of greed had made him careless. Ilara looked at him, and for the first time he saw not a grieving widow, but something as hard and unyielding as the granite under her farm. The trap, so quietly set, had just been sprung. She picked up her axe, her knuckles white. "The fair is in 2 weeks, Silas," she said, her voice quiet and final. "If you want to make an offer, you can make it there, in front of everyone." And so they stood across the dusty aisle of the livestock pavilion, the whole of Stony Creek Hollow and the surrounding counties packed in to watch. The fair was a sombre affair, the pens mostly empty, the mood funereal. Blackwood had arranged it this way. He had brought his last prize boar, the sickly Sterling VII, and had called a public meeting to discuss the future of farming in the region. It was all a stage, a theatre for the drama he intended to direct. He stood on a makeshift platform, a master of ceremonies at a wake. He spoke of shared loss, of community, of the need to pull together.
He painted a picture of devastation, and then a glimmer of hope. "But we are not without a future," he boomed, his voice echoing in the half-empty hall. "Providence, in its mysterious way, has provided us with a path forward, a path that begins right here, with one of our own." He turned and pointed dramatically at Ilara. Ilara Vaughan, a woman of great fortitude, has, through a combination of luck and compassion, sheltered the one animal who may hold the key to our survival. All eyes turned to Ilara and the dark, still form of Stout. The crowd murmured. This was the moment Blackwood had planned. The public pressure, the weight of their desperation, all directed at the solitary woman. "And so," Blackwood continued, his voice dripping with magnanimity, "in the spirit of rebuilding our community, I, on behalf of the new Breeders' Cooperative, am prepared to make a generous offer. To purchase this fine animal and his genetics for the salvation of us all. Mrs. Vaughan, I will give you $500 for your boar." A gasp went through the crowd. $500. In these times, it was a fortune. It was an offer no one could refuse. All eyes were on Ilara. They saw a poor widow being handed a lifeline, a ticket out of her hard-scrabble life. They expected tears of gratitude. They expected her to rush forward, stammering her thanks. Ilara Vaughan did nothing. She stood in her clean but worn dress, her hand resting on Stout's back, and she waited. The silence stretched, becoming its own entity in the room. It grew louder than Blackwood's speech, heavier than the crowd's expectation. Blackwood's smile began to falter. "Well, Ilara?" he prompted, a sharp edge to his voice. Finally, she spoke. Her voice was not loud, but it carried with absolute clarity to every corner of the pavilion. "He's not for sale, Silas." A stunned silence. Blackwood's face flushed a deep, mottled red. "Don't be a fool, woman. This is not the time for sentiment. People are losing their farms. I'm offering you a fortune." "You are offering me paper," Ilara said, her voice still calm, still level. "What good is paper when the last pig is gone?" She took a step forward, and the crowd parted for her as if she were royalty. Stout moved with her, his gait a low, powerful roll.
She stopped at the edge of the champion's pen and looked from the trembling, shallow-breathing Sterling VII to her own Boar, who stood solid as an oak. "You talk about arithmetic, Silas. Let's talk about it." She looked out at the faces in the crowd, the faces of the men and women who had pitied her, mocked her, and now watched her with a desperate awe. "Here is the arithmetic of greed," she said, pointing a finger at Blackwood. "It takes a gift, the bloodline of a hardy sow, and tries to sell it back to the people who need it most. It sends spies to count a widow's stock. It offers a high price to take the last of something so it can control the first of everything that comes after." Then she laid her hand flat on Stout's broad back. "And here is the arithmetic of survival. It starts with $1 and a chance. It is paid for in warm milk and mended fences, in cold nights and a child's faith. Its price can't be counted in dollars,
Because its worth is measured in tomorrow."
The crowd was utterly still, hanging on her every word. Blackwood stood, speechless, his public theatre collapsing around him. "I will not sell him," Ilara said, her voice ringing with finality. "But he will work. For any farmer in this county who needs to rebuild their herd, Stout will be here." She looked directly at Blackwood, her gaze unwavering. "The price," she said, her voice dropping slightly but losing none of its power, "is 1 piglet. The first healthy piglet from every litter he sires. That is the price. Not for me, for the Hollow, to build a new herd, together. A herd that belongs to all of us." It was an act of impossible grace. She held all the cards, all the power they had coveted and mocked. She could have named any price, could have become the wealthiest woman in the county overnight. She could have demanded revenge. Instead, she chose community. She chose a shared future over personal profit.
The farmers looked at each other. They looked at Blackwood, whose face had crumpled in on itself, a mask of public humiliation. And they looked at Ilara Vaughan, the quiet woman they had so badly misunderstood, who was now offering them not just a boar, but salvation. One by one, they began to nod, first old man Miller, then the Thompson boys. A murmur of assent grew into a chorus of agreement. She had shamed the antagonist, not with force, but with a generosity so profound it was its own form of power. She had balanced the books. 2 years later, the farm on the rocky hill was no longer a quiet place. The lane leading up to it was worn with the traffic of trucks and trailers. A new, larger barn stood beside the old one, and the sound of healthy, grunting pigs was a constant, vital music. The bloodline of Stout, the hardy, coarse-haired, intelligent boar who still roamed his woodlot, had revitalized the entire region. The pigs that now populated the farms of Stony Creek Hollow were not pretty. They were tough, resilient, and smart. They were survivors. Finn, now a lanky young man of 16, stood by the gate with a ledger, his handwriting neat and clear, tracking the lineage, directing the farmers who came to collect their gilts or bring their sows. He was no longer a neglected boy. He was Ilara's right hand, the keeper of the new arithmetic. Ilara sat on her porch, watching the scene. The house was no longer silent. It was filled with the sounds of life, of purpose. She was no longer one person alone. She was the heart of a community she had remade. Old man Hemlock sat in the rocker beside her, his gnarled hands resting on his knees. He watched a farmer lead a young, healthy sow into a trailer, a sow that carried the future in her belly. He nodded slowly, a small, rare smile touching his lips.
He looked at the rich, dark soil in Ilara's garden, at the solid stone foundations of her barn, at the thriving life all around them. "Hard ground," he said, his voice a quiet rumble. Ilara looked out at the world she had built, a world born from a single act of defiant compassion. She nodded back at him, her own smile deep and true. The roots had grown deep. The accounts, at long last, were balanced.